Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another webinar in our Digital Lounge series here at the University of Greenwich. Now, before I introduce today's exquisite panel, I would first like to make, as I always do, a few housekeeping announcements. It is excellent to see that we have a full house on Zoom. So please be reminded to put yourself on mute if you're not speaking. If you are attending as members of the audience, you will find that you can type in your comments, questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. Please do so throughout the event. I must note that we will be recording this session for those unable to attend and for archival purposes. As always, the nearest exit is at the bottom of the page where it says leave meeting, but I'm pretty sure that your cursors will stay well put. Now, a rather chilling day like this deserves a heated debate to warm up. And this is what we have in store for you today. So let me set the scene for you. In July 1995, The New Yorker publishes Peter Steiner's iconic cartoon, a dog in front of a PC screen and the caption, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." Anonymity has been indeed a double-edged sword for online communications. On the internet, you could be anyone you wanted to, spreading hate and disinformation anonymously, but also exposing the truth and your own views beyond any national censorship measures. Off the internet, available platforms to amplify speech have traditionally been few and unfortunately reserved only for popular views. The press, media in general, and a couple of public spaces, such as the Speaker's Corner in London. Now, before linking to today's Zoom session, you've probably had a quick look at your social media first. The 5 minutes that it took you to scroll down your Facebook or your Twitter feed was really enough to be bombarded with all sorts of information, ranging from the headlines to political comments, COVID vaccine discussions, or even funny or distasteful memes. And the question is this: is it time to rethink online communications? The online safety bill, published last May, is currently undergoing pre-legislative scrutiny by a joint committee, which will report its recommendations by the 10th of December. So the time is now. Together with us to discuss this further, we have a stellar all-female panel, and I'm most pleased about this one. Dr. Kim Barker from the Open University, Dr. Aysem Diker Vanberg from Goldsmith University, and as always, the Q&A will be moderated by the ever-brilliant Isabel de Oliveira, a research fellow here at Let's Lab. Thank you everyone for joining us. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Kim first to share some observations. And Kim, thank you for joining us. We're all ears.
Thanks, Agro. I'm just gonna share my slides. Everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can see.
Cool, excellent. So firstly, thank you for the invitation. And I don't think we could be talking about these issues at a more important time. So before I get on to the bill itself, let's just think about online safety for a second. How did we get here? Well, everything is online. If the pandemic didn't push us to everything being online, we would still be in an increasingly online heavy space anyway. From banking to doing your food shopping, to ordering your fresh vegetables, everything now has an online component to it. So when we're talking about online safety and the online safety bill in particular, we're really talking about daily life now. We're not talking about something which is unusual. We don't go online as a special event. We are online and connected as a default. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have some significant problems. We very much do have some significant issues, and these are not new issues. They're issues which have been building up across the last 20 or 30 years when we've kind of largely ignored regulating the online spaces, largely because lawmakers, governments, scrutiny committees don't fully understand what they're talking about or how to go about tackling those challenges. Don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. I think that's fairly accurate. And when we come to talk about the bill in particular later on, we'll see exactly why that statement is probably still fairly accurate. But we're also in a place now where we've got increasing levels of harmful information. Everything online has a hidden agenda. There is something hidden in everything. The harms which we think about in offline contexts are not necessarily the same as the harms we think about in online contexts, and trying to figure out what is a harmful piece of communication is very different to what is an illegal piece of communication, especially online. So there is a lot of thinking to be done around all of those things, and some of that thinking has led the government to claim that we need to provide the safest place in the UK to be online and to be the safest place in the world to be online, period. And that's the policy ambition behind the online safety bill. And it is an ambition, I would say, rather than a reality, because there are a number of problems with those policy ambitions. But it's good to be ambitious. It's nice to have a plan, and it's nice to think that we can move forward and be really safe online all the time. But that policy ambition is fraught with danger, and it's fraught with consequences, and it's fraught with pitfalls. And first and foremost, it is a policy fallacy. Let's be entirely clear. How can we be the safest place in the world to be online when we can be online anywhere and go anywhere in the world online? But I'll come back to that policy fallacy shortly. There was also a lot of noise around the online safety bill and what it tries to do rather than what we perhaps think it ought to be doing, and the expectations that we have placed on it as a piece of law to solve every problem in the online environment is a huge task that we're asking of one single piece of legislation. We're talking about moving away from allowing platforms to dictate what they do and don't control in their spaces, but we're also talking about how to make everything safe and mitigate harm and ensure that there's a regulated body and ensure that there are punishments and consequences and ensure that people charged with running those platforms are fulfilling their duty of care. And the list of expectations and requirements and things contained in the bill generally just goes on and on and on. But we're also talking specifically about online content. And this, I guess, is a shift away from where we've talked about content previously and before the digital era. We talked about content in the context of media regulation, but we're now talking specifically about online content as though it is different. And actually, content is content. The way in which you come across that content and the thought processes behind that content and the purpose of that content is something a bit different. But we seem to be lumping it all together for the purposes of one big thing. And that is what is now the online safety bill. I say what is now the online safety bill. It started out as the online harms bill, and it was initially going to address harm online and problems online, but it's morphed into something much broader than that. With the change of name comes a change of signalling, but actually the change of name and change of signalling doesn't address some of the concern about the content of that bill and the scare factor, which is included within some of the content of the provisions of the draft bill as well. The pledge to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online is all well and good, but when you dig deeper behind that, that pledge actually is pretty scary in terms of what it means for everyday users, for everyday pieces of content, for how we engage online and with people and content online in different places, contexts, and spaces. There's been a huge boom, as I've already said, in what we do and how we do it. And all of that is rooted through an online gatekeeper, be it a social media platform, be it some other kind of online platform. Everything we do, there is an entry point. And so really what we're talking about is how we bring together those gatekeepers and how we impose regulatory obligations on them and how we enforce those obligations, whilst, in my view, trying to protect individual speech and individual rights online. And those three things don't necessarily seem to match up from the bill and from the draft content. I don't think anybody is going to disagree that there are some serious issues with online content and online behaviours, what we do online and who does what. Mental health, well-being, suicide, self-harm, they're all well-documented issues. So is abuse, so is online violence, so is online aggression, so is disinformation, so is misinformation. So all of those problems are significant problems. What the Online Safety Bill reflects is a shift in the regulatory norm and the regulatory sphere of influence that the government is trying to wade into. In 2015, House of Lords was very clear that there was no need to change anything about the way in which we deal with online communications. It didn't feel the need, after a significant review, to suggest that there was a need for a change in the law. And yet 5 years later, we're kind of in this place where we've had this draft bill, we've been talking about it for a long time, and we're now in that place where we're looking at the nitty-gritty of the provisions and what it might mean for everyday internet use. So in a nutshell, there's the policy aim, but there is also, allegedly, according to the bill and its policy paperwork, an intention to focus on systems and processes rather than content specifically, although I would suggest that's a misnomer. There is also a question about whether focusing on systems and processes means it's different to focusing on the moderation of content. Again, I would suggest that that's smoke and mirrors, and the bill is actually really about focusing on content and how we go about controlling that content. There are significant concerns that this bill really is a threat to the freedom of expression, and I think some of the things it's suggesting, such as placing criminal liability on the directors and operators of social media platforms to ensure they comply with the law, and if not, imposing criminal sanctions, I think those things are just one aspect of the threats to freedom of expression. There are others in the bill as well, such as what you can and can't say, what is illegal, what is harmful, what is not harmful. All of that still needs a significant amount of unpacking in terms of what it means every day for people when they use these sites and platforms, and what it means for their speech when they're using these platforms online. Equally, the definitions in the draft bill, it suggests, might be suitable to reduce the presence of harmful content. But if we were talking about reducing the presence of harmful content, and harmful content is not illegal content, then that's a real red flag, because that is really just about curtailing what you can and can't say, even though that might not necessarily have a legal aspect attached to it. And then in order to do all of these things, in a nutshell, there is the question of the regulator. Who will be the regulator? What powers will the regulator have? What will the oversight be for this bill, which is going to solve all of our online problems and make it the safest place in the world to be online? And then, of course, announced this week, there are additional new offences which are going to be added to beef up the bill and to make it even more significant, robust and useful for tackling online problems. And those new proposed offences, I think, are particularly concerning, given that the bill is already in the process of, at the very least, scrutiny, if you can call it that. So the bill tries to do a huge amount of things. We're looking to the Online Safety Bill as a one-size-fits-all solution to every problem we've ever encountered in an online sphere. And I think that in itself has almost set the bill up to fail, because we're asking a huge amount of it. The new offences, the 2021 version of the Online Safety Bill, takes account of the fact that there are a number of overlapping law reform agendas going on. The Law Commission have been looking at offensive and abusive communications and how they can improve that. They've been looking at hate crime and how there might be an online dimension to that. Both of those seem now to be feeding in to the Online Safety Bill as it moves through the parliamentary process and the scrutiny processes. But the two specific offences which are likely to be added to the bill include situations where there is intention to create a sense of fear in a victim, and where you are knowingly sending false communications with the intention of causing, again, some kind of harm to the likely audience. And both of those, I think, are particularly problematic and particularly scary when it comes to speech, because they include the intention of. And I'm not entirely sure how you'd go about evidencing intention of when you're communicating via social media posts, for example. But nevertheless, those are things which the Home Office have suggested will be included in the bill. And in addition to that, new powers are also apparently going to be provided for the online safety regulator. And the online safety regulator is going to become this catch-all vehicle for addressing content and media content in the UK, period. And I think if we're asking Ofcom to deal with print media, press media, online safety, online platforms, as well as audiovisual media services, and be the regulatory body for all of those things, then that is a huge task for one regulatory body to deal with, even if it just has an aspect of oversight to it. And so that, again, I suggest, poses a number of problems, not least in terms of the sheer feasibility, given the amount of content that we're asking that one regulator to be in control of and be charged with addressing. So I think ultimately there is a need for something in the context of dealing with online safety, online content, but I'm not convinced that the online safety bill is in itself the way that we should be going in order to try and tackle some of these issues. There are greater problems with the online safety bill, even though it has been tweaked, changed, and amended. And one of the perhaps most significant gaps in that, at least from my perspective, is what about the safety of women online? There are a huge number of references to children in the bill, understandably, given the emphasis now on safety. But in the initial iteration of it as the online harms bill, there was still a huge number of references to children and very few references to women. And actually what we've seen throughout particularly the course of the pandemic is this increase in recognition that being online and being an outspoken woman presents particular challenges and particular problems in terms of the abuse, the violence, and the content that you get. And I think in light of the fact that there are a number of moves at a European level and a regional level to address digital forms of violence against women, for this bill to overlook that aspect is a significant weakness from the outset. And if it doesn't address that gap, then there are going to be greater problems further down the line in terms of tackling some of those problems. Equally, though, the bill is going to introduce a duty of care, and that duty of care is the cornerstone of this bill. And really, while we have duties of care that are imposed by statute in other areas, particularly occupiers' liability, for example, where it does work quite well, I don't think we can really say that occupiers' liability is exactly the same as an online duty of care for online safety. And so I think that really is just, to coin a phrase, Pandora's box of problems for us waiting further down the line. I've already said about Ofcom as the regulator. It's a giant regulator for all forms of media. There are better and alternative options to Ofcom. And I suggest that what started out as an initial, we can just base it on Ofcom as a model, has morphed into, let's make it easy for ourselves as a starting point and an initial period of regulation, let's use an existing body. But I think that in itself presents a number of challenges given the different content and the different forms of media that we're asking Ofcom to deal with in the online context versus the offline context. And then, of course, we are still talking about content moderation, albeit we're not calling it content moderation. If we're talking about curtailing speech and limiting what is harmful and illegal, then we are essentially talking about curtailing speech on the basis of what are quite vague concepts and quite vague definitions. So there's a huge amount of consideration to be given to all of those things. And this bill, in my opinion, is at the minute nowhere near where it should be in order to be put through as a piece of legislation. But it's not just a UK problem. The problems are broader than the UK. There is wide-ranging agreement that online regulation needs something, but I think we're quite rapidly heading from zero to way too much. We've gone from kind of very little that's very specific to online to this place where we need specific bespoke online regulation in the form of the online safety bill or the online harms bill. And I think that in itself presents a number of additional challenges for us, because we're thinking one-dimensionally in the context of one bill will solve it all, and one bill will not solve it all. America has been trying to grapple with online content for a number of years. New Zealand has legislated on it. Australia is in the process of legislating on e-safety. Canada is following the UK's model to an extent with their own version of online harms. The EU is taking a slightly different approach in its Digital Services Act. And that, again, is a different approach, but it is introducing different elements of oversight and regulation for platforms to have to engage with. And none of these really are engaging with the content challenge and the user problem. They're all targeted at the platforms because that is the regulatory place to go in terms of where the content is. But there are broader issues that can't just be addressed by regulating the platforms. It's not just the platforms. Platforms provide a space, but the platforms themselves don't really deal with the content. They're not providers of content, they are hosts of content. And so we're imposing a burden on them, really, which is to target behaviours of the users. And I think that presents an additional level of complexity and some concern about who we're asking to be responsible and who we're asking to regulate. And it seems like we're just farming it out to private entities to police their spaces. And they haven't been particularly good at that previously, so I'm not sure why we think imposing a regulatory oversight body such as Ofcom will change that particular position. So, in conclusion, despite my negativity, there is cause for some optimism. There is hope on the horizon. We do need something to address some of the challenges online, and we need to start somewhere. And if we have to start somewhere, we may as well start with the online safety bill, as it now is. But that's as far as my optimism goes. For the rest of it, I'm afraid I'm a pretty big skeptic. I have a number of worries about the online safety bill. I'm not sure it's going to be able to do what we're expecting it to do. I'm not sure that we're really completely coherently versed in what is possible versus what is feasible versus what the legislation can actually do and trigger. And I think we're anticipating that it's a magic fix. It's like a golden opportunity. And actually, the way in which the current government is addressing that presents some real concerns, not least because this government at the moment seems to be very much set on curtailing the ability to speak and to protest and to criticise in the public domain. So that, I think, is also particularly problematic. Not least because the online safety bill is being tweaked, even though it's notionally through the process of scrutiny. But it's not just that. The government are also changing the police and courts bill to change the way in which we protest. And if we have limitations on what is harmful but not illegal in an online context, and we can't protest clearly and freely offline, then I think those two things come together to present some real challenges for speech generally going forward in this country and in our online borders as well. So I will leave it there and park my skepticism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kim. That was excellent. I enjoyed the the ray of optimism at the end, which was as far as it went, I guess. And I also note something very important from your presentation, which has to do with wording as well. One example is harms, which has turned into safety. Another one is content moderation, which we all use. And in certain cases, you are right in saying that it actually is a very vague way of insinuating lots of wishy-washy circumstances of ultimately curtailing speech. I will now hand over the floor to Aysem to carry on with your own presentation, mainly in the interest of time, because I would like to give it as much as we can in the Q&A. Aysem, who has been together with us up until recently, and a dear colleague, if I may say so, now joining us for this digital lab from Goldsmiths. Aysem, the floor is all yours, and we are all ears.
Hi, can you hear, can you see my slides?
Everything is perfect, sound and image.
Perfect. I must admit, it's always a challenge to present after Kim, because she's such a fantastic presenter. I was almost going to ask Agira to put me first, go through my boring set of slides, then have Kim as, you know, the treat. But unfortunately, you need to live with this. So there's going to be quite a few, obviously, overlaps in our presentation with Kim. And I think in all the online conferences you attend, you'll hear a disclaimer, you know. And here goes our disclaimer, I suppose, Kim hasn't mentioned. Kim and myself, we were involved in drafting written evidence to the Joint Committee for the Draft Online Safety Bill. And a bit of self-promotion. If you Google, you know, Draft Online Safety Bill, and we were involved, you know, on giving this written evidence on behalf of BILETA, British and Irish Law Education and Technology Association. You can also read our, you know, more detailed comments on the Draft Online Safety Bill. So I think I'll go through the brief structure of my presentation. I'll first talk about, you know, what am I going to focus on this presentation? What's the kind of research question? I was going to give a basic draft glance at what the bill is about, but Kim has covered most of the stuff. So I'll again, you know, focus on the shortcomings of the draft safety bill. I'll actually go through a couple of provisions as well with you guys. And also I'll offer some conclusions, and I'll hopefully make recommendations for amendments. I share the pessimism that unfortunately Kim has, but I'm hoping that, we are stuck with this bill. Whether we like it or not, it's going to happen. So I'm hoping that hopefully the bill in its current form is really not all we are asking for. Hopefully we can change things a bit. As Agiro earlier on said, it's currently at the joint committee, and by 10th of December, they're supposed to submit a report. And I'm hoping that, I want to, remain an optimist, and that they would be able to tweak and make some significant changes to it before it actually becomes a bill. So why content is important? Let's get started with that. Why are we always talking about content? And I'm sure in one presentation you attended, you heard about this. As we speak in this, moment, in the next 60 seconds, there will be 100,000 tweets sent. 204 million emails are sent in a minute. Google in a minute receives 2 million queries. And in a minute, 48 hours of new video is uploaded on YouTube. And Facebook users, as we speak, in a minute is uploading almost 6,000, 85,000 pieces of content. So content is a huge issue. And as Kim mentioned, nobody argues the fact that, we need to do something about, especially harmful content. But the question we have is whether the current bill is up to this task, and whether it's able to achieve the intentions, all the intentions that the government is proposing. My short answer, and the paper suggests that the bill in its current form is not likely to achieve any of these objectives. In fact, it will be a threat to freedom of expression and place the power in the hands of social networks. So at a glance, if you look at the provisions of it, the draft bill deals with user-to-user services and search services. It makes two distinctions. It talks about illegal content, and I think roughly we all know what illegal content is: content relating to terrorism, child sexual exploitation, abuse, etc. So the regular suspects. But the problematic issue about the bill is it also talks about legal but harmful content, which is the biggest issue. Because, when you say illegal content, we can all understand it. But what is legal but harmful content? Well, the long and short of it, the bill doesn't know as well. It could be anything, because, as I said, it's so vague. And there is some, of course, definition in the bill. But to this day, nobody knows what is meant by legal but harmful content. This is number one issue about the bill. There are also a lot of obligations outlined in the draft bill, particularly quite burdensome obligations on providers of services, which are called Category 1 service providers. So what are the issues of the bill? And most of them have been succinctly summarized by Kim. First of all, we have an issue with the scope of the bill. It's so broad, so vague. We have the duty care approach. Again, adds further to the vagueness. We also have an issue with giving unprecedented powers to private companies like, Facebook, Google, and trusting that it will all turn out fine. And we have the potential chilling effect on free speech. And of course, we have the issue with Ofcom. So, broad scope of the draft bill. Despite some alterations, the bill still remains to be very, very vague when it comes to especially legal but harmful content. And if you were to have one takeaway from this presentation, if somebody asked you, what is draft online safety bill is about, I think you can describe it only with one word: vague. God knows. As Kim said, the intention is good, I agree, but the method, the way it's delivered, is not understandable, not comprehensible. So take the example of section 46.3 of the draft bill, which defines legal but harmful content as, content having or indirectly having a significant adverse physical or psychological impact on an adult of ordinary sensibilities. We're all lawyers. I hope most of us are lawyers. So what do you understand from this definition? Nothing, really. I mean, who is an adult of ordinary sensibilities? And what do we mean by indirect harm? Of course, none of these have been, explained on the bill. And also definitions such as illegal content. All of these things, by the way, is left to either secondary legislation or, a code of conduct, which is going to be adopted by Ofcom. So I guess if we could say in a word, the bill is about lots of intentions, lots of aims, lots of terms just dropped without really filling in what they mean. And when you question these things, they say all of these will be regulated by secondary legislation. Don't worry, we don't know what illegal but harmful content is, but soon, hopefully, we'll know. And that could be anything the government wants, really. So, look at this definition. I mean, I for one fact, really struggle to understand what is an indirect harm, what could have an impact on adult of ordinary sensibilities. We all have different sensibilities. So what is an adult of ordinary sensibilities? Anyhow, I'm not going to carry on talking about that. But as I said, vagueness is one keyword that defines the whole bill. And again, the bill introduces this new duty of care approach, which, as Kim mentioned, might work in a couple of areas of law, but in the scope of, online content and moderation, what does that mean? Again, there is a lot of emphasis on duty of care, and there's a lot of obligations on service providers, but again, the bill doesn't really show how this duty of care is going to operate. So, in other words, you're saying to service providers, you have to do a lot of things, but you're not telling them how to do it, but you must do it. And of course, I don't sympathize Facebook and other social media companies, but this must be a quite shock for them as well, because they're given a lot of responsibility, liabilities, and as Kim said, hefty fines without actually giving them clear guidance as to how are they going to operate this duty of care. So as Graham Smith suggested, the imposition of all these various duties under the bill is going to have only one effect. They lead to censorship and over removal, because all these service providers, all these platforms will be massively afraid of failing their duty of care. So as a knee-jerk reaction, they're just going to remove any content without really questioning whether it's legal or not. Another issue about the bill is the fact that we place so much power to the hands of companies that we've been moaning about all these years. We're talking about Google, Facebook being evil. Then the act makes a small shift and say, you know what? These are evil companies, but let's place all our trust. In Google, we trust. Let's place all our, trust to these companies. There is a few, duties on these companies to minimize the presence of priority illegal content, minimize the length of time which priority, and by the way, nobody knows what priority illegal content, that is to be determined later again. But of course, scholars are criticizing this approach because this is way beyond what could be expected of hosting providers. If you look at, EU's e-commerce directive, you can't impose general monitoring obligations on hosting providers. So are Facebook and social media companies supposed to spy on the content? Because so far, what we're familiar with is, once the content is out there, they can take down content. But this act goes one step further and suggests that, before even the content is, placed, you should be vigilant and make sure it's not there. So this is I think, if you read the statements of Honorable Oliver Dow, he basically says this is going to make the UK the safest place to be online. But in fact, it's going to be making the UK the biggest censorship, the country in terms of the biggest censorship laws. So we will be first in relation to something, but not in terms of online safety. So I think this cartoon again, and I saw this quote, and which really resonated with me. We are all moaning about social media companies. We're all moaning about, Google, and rightfully so, all these evil companies. And suddenly we trust, and we let them become the arbiters of what speech should be allowed online. Because, the logic of the bill really defeats me. On one hand, as I said, the intention is good, but the government is actually saying, we couldn't deal with it. Why don't we let Facebook deal with it? And that is incredibly problematic. Another issue is, of course, as Kim mentioned, potential chilling effect on free speech. Because of all these vagueness in the bill, especially when it comes to especially when it comes to legal but harmful content, there's a risk that a vast majority of content, without even being checked, will be removed by the service providers. And of course, this coupled with hefty fines introduced in the bill will be acting as a mechanism for service providers to actually get rid of content without truly checking what's there in the first place. And of course, this could be used by governments or anyone to silence minority and marginalized groups. And that is a big issue. Another problem, as Kim mentioned, is the imposition of criminal liability on senior management. I mean, at the end of the day, we want to have a dialogue with these companies. We want to have an ongoing, interaction with these companies. Without social media companies, without Google on board, we're not going to able to enforce our laws. So this is a big issue as well. And finally, coming back to what Kim mentioned, choice of Ofcom as the regulatory body to be on top of this new regime. Ofcom is already dealing with a massive remit. They're already in charge of, all sorts of telecommunications. And you can see that they're just far too busy dealing with complaints about TV episodes. Imagine how many complaints they receive in relation to Celebrity Big Brother. So you're suddenly asking Ofcom, which already lacks staff, and of course, never mind, they don't have the competence to deal with, the online environment. You're asking too much of them without giving them the necessary resources. So this brings me to the preliminary conclusions, really. I think this is something we also discussed in our bi-letter written evidence. We are all agreeing that there is something inherently wrong about content. Well, there is the issue of course, online hatred speech. There is a lot, child exploitation, etc. So there is definitely illegal content. I think we all agree that there is illegal content. But, legal and harmful content, what is it really? Because in my opinion, maybe I'm a simple human being, either something is legal or illegal. Whereas this act tries to come up with something really new, like legal but not desirable, harmful without, of course, explaining clearly what that is. So I guess the overall response to the bill is that the intention is understandable, it's clear, but the draft bill really is so vague that it's not going to likely to achieve what it's intending to. And in return, due to the vagueness, it is significantly open to abuse and misuse. So at its best, the draft is a work in progress. And any legislation in this field, as Kim mentioned, I mean, this is almost, mission impossible, but needs to strike a balance between protecting online users plus protecting freedom of speech. And at this very minute, the draft bill places the main emphasis on the word they love, safety. Safety at the expense of freedom of speech. So what can we do? As I said, unfortunately, no matter what we say here, I am of the opinion that the government, one way or another, is going to pass this. So what can we say? What will happen, hopefully, is that we've, in the first place, want to get rid of the distinction between illegal content and legal but harmful content, because that's so unhelpful, such a useless thing to say. And what really we would want to see from the government is actually clarity in relation to illegal content, and get rid of this legal but harmful content, which could be, as I said, used to silence minority opinions, etc., marginalized groups. So then we want to see clarity in relation to a lot of things in the bill, such as, definition of harm, what is indirect harm, the notion of duty. So the bill requires to be most of the provisions needs to be revisited and needs more clarity to avoid misuse and censorship. Finally, this is a personal issue I have. The draft bill applies to all platforms, irrespective of their size. So, the idea, some think this is to get the big fish like Facebook, Google, but essentially this will apply to all platforms, no matter, how small content they'll deal with. I think this is an issue also, as Kim said, one size, doesn't fit all. And this bill, I mean, the target group, the intended group is what? So I think this bill needs to maybe take that into consideration as well. And finally, Ofcom, again, in our bi-letter paper, we said there could be far better and more competent bodies to deal with it. For instance, ICO, Information Commissioner's Office, could perhaps be a better body because they have experience dealing with data protection, online environments far better than Ofcom, or perhaps, establishing a completely new independent body could be the answer. But as I said, keep an eye on what's going on by the 10th of December. One way or another, this bill is going to pass. But the question as a community, I think we should ask is how much pressure we can place on the government and, on the key stakeholders to hopefully change and amend this bill to a large extent. That's all I can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aysem. That was spot on. And I have to say 20 minutes, very, very well spent. I know it's not it's not enough time really to discuss everything. I can see that a couple of people are already discussing a few interesting points. So here is what I suggest we do. We are now opening the floor to discussion. In a rather democratic fashion. I am made the host of this event, which means that I can unmute people from the audience and that way give them a voice, actually giving them a voice. So I can see that Mark and Stephen, they've already contributed with a couple of comments. So if you would like also to be heard and to take the floor, please let me know so that I can put you off mute, as I am the host, the content moderator, as, as Kim pointed out. So I will be handing now over to Isabel to moderate discussion. At the same time, please feel free to send me a direct message. Let me know if you would like to be off mute so that you can ask your own questions. Isabel, the floor is all yours now for the Q&A.
Thank you. I was also checking the discussion, which seems very nice on the chat. So I would recommend everyone to also have a look into it. So we have a few questions that I've been writing down as we have been going. So one of the first ones I would like to ask you is regarding your point of potentially making directors be liable for what happens on their platform. What if these services are hosted overseas from the director or even the UK entirely?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. So I think the proposal that senior managers be held responsible and are fined if their platforms don't comply with whatever regulatory system is imposed is not one which is necessarily going to change behavior of platforms. If people are overseas, based outside of the jurisdiction in which these rules are introduced, then that's just another problem for enforcement, really. And that is part and parcel of the problems with all of these things. It's in large part why most online platforms are based in Ireland rather than in the UK or in a different part of Europe. There are lots of technical reasons. They'll base themselves where they can to limit their possible liabilities as far as they possibly can do it. And yet, I'm not sympathetic to any of them, but at the same time, I can totally understand why they would seek to do that and why they would seek to put themselves in a place which is more open and less restrictive as to what they might or might not want to do. I don't know how you get around it as an enforcement problem. It is an enforcement problem, but that's not going to be an enforcement problem for Ofcom. There's no way Ofcom can be the policing body and the enforcement body and the regulator and the oversight body and be charged with dealing with all of the secondary legislation where they might or might not decide what is or is not vague in the context of harm and legal content. So I'm not going to change my skepticism. I just think it's one suggestion in the bill which is likely to fall on slightly deaf ears.
Thank you. Aysem, would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, I agree with Kim, but essentially, I don't agree with the aim of, keeping the directors liable. In quite a few areas of law, you have, provisions that try to keep company directors liable, and that always almost goes horribly wrong, because the idea, take the company law, for instance, the idea is to keep the corporation responsible. We're not looking for scapegoats, one executive director or chief officer of the company. I mean, what we essentially want to change is the culture in that company. And, to be able to do that, you need to hold the corporation liable, if that's the intention. But again, like, Kim mentioned that as well, I think we're really confusing several issues when it comes to content. I mean, Facebook, Google, yes, they're evil and all that, but are they responsible for all the bad content out there? There are actually people who create these content. So why go after the companies who are merely acting as a conduit? They're just a platform. And I think essentially this is the problem. Instead of finding the perpetrators, we're going for the easiest target, in a sense, with this bill.
No, yeah, totally agree with that. I don't think it's correct for them to go after the directors. But thank you very much for answering this question. And then this also kind of leads me to the next one from Mehmet Bilal. It says, what is the biggest problem in this emerging sphere of law according to you? Is it about criteria, enforcement, or international cooperation? Any of you would like to start?
Should I have a go, or Kim? I mean, the way I see it, could you repeat the last bit of the question? Because it was a, yeah.
So what is the biggest problem in this emerging sphere of law according to you? Is it about criteria, enforcement, or international cooperation?
Well, if we're talking about moderation of online content, there are a few issues. First of all, as this presentations, I think, show, we all agree that something must be done. I think everybody pretty much is on board, you know, Facebook, Google, these are evil companies, let's do something. But the question is the method. How do we deal with these things? Like, you know, the laws, what laws will be appropriate? That is number one issue. So I suppose you can say that is the enforcement issue. How are you going to enforce it? And what laws are you going to propose to make that happen? Second issue, we need to, I think, bear in mind that all these issues are quite global issues. This, you know, content moderation or bad content is not an issue specific to the UK. As you know, Kim mentioned, there are, you know, quite a few jurisdictions who are dealing with that. So I think some form of harmonization, which obviously not going to happen, or collaboration is key to deal with global issues. You know, UK on its own, I think, shouldn't be tackling these issues, although it's going to happen. I think essentially you want all the relevant and civilized Western societies to be on board, to work with one another to develop best practices, to have consistency as well. But yeah, in reality, is it achievable? That's another day's discussion.
Thank you. Kim, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so I surprisingly don't disagree. What I would say is I think we're coming at it from the wrong place for the right reasons. So we have the right aim in mind to tackle the problem, but we're coming at it from a very strange place where we want to be quite technical but also quite broad, and we want to talk about rights but we also want to talk about protections, we want to talk about imposing liability but we also want to talk about making people responsible. And actually it's all of those things, and in some respects it's not the platform's fault. I'm just putting it out there. A lot of it is the way in which we as users and people who use those platforms behave. So there is much more to talk about in terms of our behavior on those platforms, because they're just a vehicle, right? It's like how we behave in the street. There are laws which tell us what we can and can't and should and shouldn't do in terms of behaviors. And I don't think we're necessarily thinking about behaviors in the same way online that we would think about them offline. And for whatever reason, we seem to, I say we, the regulators have taken a different approach and are not necessarily listening to what I would say is sense when it comes to thinking about these things in a different way.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think we have time to squeeze in one more question from Daniel. Considering the issue of free speech and against censorship, to what extent will the bill protect an individual from being banned to use a specific online platform like Twitter when it comes to providers that put forward a certain social agenda and aim to censor opposing ideologies? Would you like me to say it again, or would you like to? No? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't hear you properly. Did you say that you would like me to repeat?
No, we can see I can see the question in front of me. Do you want to have a go, Kim, or do you want me to get started?
Yeah, no, so I think first and foremost, I don't think it will protect an individual from being banned from a platform. So I don't think the bill is going anywhere near that level of individual protectionism. It's not about the individual in many respects. It's about how to make the platform responsible and how to impose liability on them. And ultimately, while it's not necessarily a proper argument, nobody makes you join a social media platform. Nobody makes you engage on a social media platform. It's entirely up to you. It's voluntary. You sign up for it. You agree by their rules. They're supposed to agree by the law. That's the way it works. So it is about choice. And there are suggestions that real name policies and anonymity is going to be banned, and they're going to legislate to prevent that happening. I don't think David Davis and his support for that is necessarily going anywhere. It's not a solution. But there's nothing to stop you being banned with one identity and one email address on a platform, and then immediately turning around and signing up for a different account. So yeah, there's no protection for the individual. It's not about the individual. And I think the chilling effects, the problems with speech, the way in which we're empowering private entities to be the arbiters, gatekeepers, ring fencers of speech, and all of those issues means that basically, ultimately, it's the individual users that are getting shafted, not the platforms. I can put it like that.
Thank you. Aysem, would you like?
I agree with, again, we're a very agreeable panel, but we should have had more controversy. But the bill, I think the interesting thing about the bill is it suggests that it's all about protecting us as users, right? From harm. Well, it's for our safety. But if you look at the provisions, it doesn't place the emphasis on individuals. So I think that's where Daniel is thinking, this should be about protecting individuals. No, the bill is not about protecting individuals. This is about placing some responsibility on platforms in terms of how they deal with content. So there is actually no safeguards in the bill for individuals. If a platform decides that, the content you posted is legal but harmful, then they are going to take down. They might be banning you, and the bill doesn't provide, any safeguards for individuals in that sense. And I think that is also ultimately problematic because, the bill is presented as online safety bill, which makes us think it's all about us. But in fact, it doesn't give any rights to individuals in that sense. Like if you compare and contrast it with GDPR is all about individual empowerment, users empowerment. But this bill has nothing to do with individuals. In fact, I think it is likely to take a lot from individuals' rights. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I don't think we have time to put any more questions, but I would like to really thank you all for coming and for having such a nice panel and talk. And I don't know if Yara would like to add anything extra before we finish.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Isabel. An excellent job as always moderating Q&A. In the interest of time, we'll have to finish the session here, but please feel free to carry on discussing these very interesting matters, either on social media, the irony of things, or hopefully in person once everything goes back to normal and all academics are able to discuss once again in person over bad coffee. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone very much for joining. I will finish the session here. Many thanks to our speakers, our guest speakers for today, Kim Barker and Aysem Diker Vanberg. I will leave you with a final note, which is, I'm not sure if you've heard, Meta and Facebook have delayed plans on end-to-end encryption to postpone to 2023. Put one and one together, and I will leave you with this note. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.